Hey guys, it's Christian Butzek, Vancouver Realtor. Thanks for tuning in. The topic of today's video is BC assessment and what you need to know. And I want to talk about this because a lot of people make mistakes and how they think about BC assessment. So the first thing is, let's talk about why it's used. It's used because the government needs to have if they're going to assess you a property tax, they need to have a value for your home. And that's all it is. It's a tool for an approximate value, and your municipality taxes you based on the BC assessment for things like services like policing, schooling, etc. Now, the thing about BC assessment is buyers and sellers put too much stock into it. They make mistakes. I've had the experience where I sit down at a kitchen table with a family and they get out the BC assessment and say, look, my home's worth 1.5 million. It says it here. And no, it doesn't work that way. The BC assessment is really just a snapshot in time. Think of it as kind of like a weather forecast. It's very general, and it may be off by $200,000 for a house, often by a condo as much as $100,000, at least in the last 6 months of 2020. So take BC assessment with a grain of salt. It's not written in stone. And in this video, I want to give you 3 examples of how it can be misleading, and you need to know. So let's look at the first one. First example here is just that BC assessed values can be way off the mark. Several years ago, I was looking on behalf of a buyer of mine, and he was interested in a property in Vancouver East. I took a look at the BC assessed values, and I thought, this doesn't make sense. Seller's asking $600,000, the assessed value says $300,000. Why the huge gap? And I put on my investigative journalist hat, and I called the authority, and I asked them, what's going on? And they said, oh, don't pay attention to it. It doesn't work in that example for the home you're referencing, Christian. And I asked, why not? And they said, well, it's a small strata. There's only 4 units. It was a self-managed strata, and it was really the only one on that block and actually in the area. So what happens is, if there haven't been any sales in the last year, BC assessed values will begin to skew wildly, right? And because the assessed values are reflected back to the Canada Day, the 6 months prior to when you receive the new value. So important thing to remember is that the values are only based on the Canada Day 6 months prior. And if there haven't been any sales in the last month, it could be totally off the mark, okay? Second thing, and this is a great example of how the system can be gamed, but in a fair way. I had a realtor colleague of mine who one day told me that he had done several $100,000 worth of renovations. What he did before he was about to sell his place is he called, and it may have not have been right before he was selling his place, but a few years before, he called BC assessment and said, I've done these improvements to the home, and I want you to reflect that in my new BC assessment. Now, of course, he would have been paying thousands of dollars more in taxes over those years, but he would have been very happy with the end result, because instead of his home being valued at 1.6, now it's valued at 1.8 with the improvements. And of course, knowing that so many buyers pay too much attention, even place too much value on that assessed number, he actually would have garnered a lot more in the sale of his home. So you can see that actually, as a seller, reporting your renovations to BC assessment can be in your best interest. And as a buyer, you need to know that, whether that's reflected in the assessed value or not. Very important, right? Third thing, timing. The timing of sales in your building. I'll give you an example. Here, the building that I live in versus a building in Yaletown, where one of my clients lives. In his building, the assessed value, when the assessed values just came out, units have gone up over $100,000. In ours, they've gone down by $50,000. What gives? I'll tell you what gives. What gives is, in our building, for example, right around Canada Day this year, we had a very low sale. In fact, I remember when the unit came online, the listing, and I looked at it and I told my wife, I said, this is insane. This looks like it's underpriced by $40,000 or so. And it was. It ended up selling in about 72 hours, which usually is indicative of a low price. Now, maybe the seller had to sell really quickly. I don't know the situation there. However, in my client's building in Yaletown, the opposite was the case, where you had sales, obviously, that were much higher around Canada Day and in the spring of 2020. So sometimes the timing works in favor of your building, but sometimes it works against it, okay? And you have to work with that. So you can't believe a government document like BCS assessment. At least you can't take it to the bank. That's the point I'm trying to make. Now, just a few other matters here before we wrap. In the last half of 2020, especially for the detached housing market and townhouses, values picked up a lot. People didn't want to share elevators because of the fear of the coronavirus, maybe catching something. They want more space. So homes were very active, houses especially. A house, let's say in Burnaby, you take Burnaby North, Brentwood area, Parkcrest, or even the Government Road. A house that would have sold for $1.8 million this spring, right after the lockdown, 6 months later, it was going for $2 million. So that's 6 months. And the point I want to make here is the 6 months that passes from the summer, the valuation date of Canada Day, to when you receive your assessment in the mail, it can be a totally different market. Values can change sometimes by $200,000. So be aware of that. And we've seen that. We've experienced that this year with the coronavirus and the lockdown it caused from March until pretty much the end of May. Okay? And finally, true market value really is where what a buyer is willing to pay for your home and what a seller is willing to sell it for. So where those two meet, that's really market value, okay? So assessed values, helpful for the government to raise taxes, but never ever think that that is the precise value of your home. It may be off by a couple $100,000. And that's why what you would do if you were thinking of selling, you'd call someone in like me. I would put on my investigative journalist hat. I'd make my phone calls, do my digging, and really kind of bullseye in on what the value of your home would be, okay? If you have any questions, comments, leave those in the chat below, and I'd be happy to look into it. Have a great 2021, and we'll see you next time.